Thank you, Madam President, and good evening to my colleagues. Madam President, before I delve into this bill, I just want to beg leave of you just for a minute. Earlier, you spoke of my participation on the Advisory Council for CARICOM Impacts, and just to give members and those who are listening a bit more information on that. St. Lucia's representatives are Dr. Stephen King, former Chief Medical Officer, pathologist, and myself. My capacity is simply in the area of communications and someone who, advocates generally against violence. And so we met in Barbados last week. And the purpose of this advisory committee is to really look at the economic impact of firearms, how you can track them, and we learned greatly that even in sister island of Jamaica, they have a ballistics department where they can map out where guns are, where gangs are. And it was very interesting for me to come this afternoon and notice that in one of our SIs, we have an appointment of a ballistics expert. I think this is a great achievement for our government, is a great achievement for the people, that as we move forward in tackling crime, that we have these interventions that we are able to use, like the establishment and accreditation of the forensic lab. So our participation, the information will continue to come out of CARICOM Impacts, which is really an organization working on gun control and the like in the Caribbean. So as the time progresses, we'll be able to give more information on that. Madam President, moving to the matter at hand.
I thought you'd give the senators a little update on your attendance at the ICC of the caucus in Washington.
Yes, I can also do that. I also represented as co-chair of St. Lucia's Conservation Caucus in Washington, D.C. earlier in September. And my role was really to speak of how plastic pollution affects our waters, how plastic pollution affects our economy. And some of the highlights of my presentation on a panel with UN and UN Environmental Program was really to show that we are in support of a global plastics treaty. I was very surprised that, we don't have a global plastics treaty as yet. But as we continue to see the warming of the environment and how plastic continues to add to the disaster that we face, it was very important for governments to come together, heads of government to come together to understand that a global plastics treaty needs to be enacted. And what this will address is the full cycle of plastics. In St. Lucia, we've made tremendous strides as it relates to collaboration of the ministry, the Department of Sustainable Development, and also the OECS with the Replast initiative. So in St. Lucia, we are able to collect the plastics, the plastic bottles. There are programs going on. Persons get incentivized for bringing the plastics, and the incentives take the form of points where they could use in the supermarket, the gas station. But the challenge is, after we collect the plastics, we either dispose of it at the landfill or we have to export the plastics. So the rest of the cycle of the plastic production of the process can be utilized. We don't have a plastic plant in St. Lucia. We don't have a recycling plant that focuses on that. And it was interesting to learn that even after we have a ban on single-use plastics, especially, and even on styrofoam products, we still have a long way to go in terms of managing that. And so the challenge that we face is when we bundle the plastics together and we ship it out, we still add to the pollution, because you have to pay for fuel of a ship, and you have to pay for the transportation. And we know with global challenges post-COVID-19, supply chain issues, I know that St. Lucia sometimes has to ship plastics to Trinidad or has to ship it to Honduras, but we don't use the full cycle of the plastics. And it was interesting, Madam President, if I might add, that when I attended the Taiwan St. Lucian Expo a few weeks ago, I was able to purchase a piece of handcrafted jewelry that was made out of a vinyl tape. And I was very intrigued by the fact that, locals are still using that. And yes, it was an effort to support a small business, but it really gave me, hope and ideas that, we can still figure out how we can make full use of the plastics here. So our contribution was, yes, plastic pollution can affect us on a tourism standpoint, because when tourists come to St. Lucia, they don't want to see the waters muddied with plastic. It affects our food security because we consume fish and there are microplastics that we can consume as a result. And so a lot of these things can have significant negative impacts on our overall GDP. So my presentation as an advocate for sustainable development was simply, in a nutshell, on that. Thank you, Madam, for that time to fully explain. Now, moving to the matter of the bill before us, I noted specifically that it did not speak of regulating cannabis. I noted that it was very broad, as members who have gone before me said, and spoke of regulated substances bill. And of course, cannabis will be included in that. Now, Madam President, I have to say that I do appreciate the comments made by the suggestions made by the independent senator and of course the opposition members. Some of the comments, I think are valid, some of which need some elucidation, and I will do my best to try to bring some light to some of these items. The first thing I wanted to note was I thought this bill was very remarkable, because in first part it speaks of the regulated substance. In second part it speaks of the establishment of the authority. It also speaks of the establishment of a tribunal to oversee the actions of an authority in the event someone brings up a concern. And yes, it does speak of a fund. So I will address just these few. When I look at where we came from, Madam President, and where we are now, I have to say, as someone who was always a supporter of the regulation of the industry, that I'm particularly impressed that this SLP administration has been able to do so much in this industry in such a short space of time. I remember I was not even on the political scene as yet, and I interviewed Mr. Andrew De Keris, better known as Pancho, on a talk show that I had, an independent talk show. And he spoke of his advocacy and the legalization of marijuana. We did have some differences because I believe that it needs to be a regulated industry, and I will tell you why. Not so long after our conversation with Mr. Pancho, that was about 2018 going into 2019, I noted that the governments who at the time engaged in a series of consultations. So it did not surprise me that this was also included on page 13, and that is section 6, number 1, where it speaks of a comprehensive public health education and training program to raise public awareness, especially for high-risk groups. We have to understand that the reason why we had to regulate cannabis or decriminalize a certain amount of cannabis is because it is still a drug. And so we have to raise this awareness, Madam President, to ensure that it is not used loosely, as the member opposite did speak of when she shared her concerns on that. But what the administration did, and that was before her time being appointed as a temporary senator, within the first 100 days, the Philip J. Pierre administration came in and regulated the use or the possession of up to 30 grams of marijuana. What this said was that persons of special interest groups, whether it be the Rastafarians, the boys on the block, whoever decided that it was their right to do so, the government acknowledged that it was their right to do so. But just as tobacco has its regulations and also has a stiff penalty, and I noticed the member raised that about a levy on cannabis, I wanted to just remind the opposition, the leader of opposition business, that it is still a drug. And so certain penalties would apply, certain levies will apply. And even the Prime Minister did speak of an increase of up to 50% on the duties for the importation of tobacco. And Madam President, this is really because whereas it is within your right to practice and consume and to do what you feel you need to do with your body, it is still not entirely legal. So in the first 100 days, the government decriminalized up to 30 grams of marijuana. The second intervention made by this administration was to expunge the records of persons who were convicted for the possession of that amount. Madam President, it was so important for us to do so because, yes, the prisons are already filled. Yes, we are aware that that custody suites was broken down. We complain daily about the cost of maintaining inmates at the facility. A lot of these young men, ambitious as they would have been incarcerated for the possession of, let's say now, up to 30 grams of marijuana. The time it will take for them to be in the prison, the time it will take for them to have a hearing, and the amount of skills that they would have lost out on, the opportunities that they would have lost out on, madam, it would have made it very challenging for them to be reintegrated into society, considering sometimes people are on remand for sometimes 4 or 5 years for even a small possession. So I thought it was quite remarkable of this administration to ensure that we made those strides to give those young men, well, I say young men because it's mostly young men, to give them a second chance where they could go back into society and, learn a skill, etc., and to allow for their records to be cleared, and so they can now find gainful employment. Madam President, this, in my mind, marks our third intervention at getting a closer step to where we want to be. But there are so many challenges that face us, not just locally, but also internationally. Now, the senator also spoke of, us ensuring that we don't reinvent the wheel, and I agree. And that is why the Minister for Commerce did make those trips to learn from our partner, our sister countries, what it is that they are doing. And I just want to highlight 2 things that I also discovered. In St. Vincent, whilst they have regulated it to an extent, there are still challenges that they face in terms of transacting. And so the banks demanded or ensured that they needed to create a separate fund from the organization so that they can ensure that this is tracked. Now, we know when it comes to drugs, there are certain things that could come to mind, whether it be money laundering, trafficking, and so that in itself is a regulation that we had to follow. This is why a separate fund had to be implemented. Now, in addition to that, I think it was the independent senator brought about the concern of the minister setting the retail price of a regulated substance. And I think on the opposition side, they echoed those sentiments. Madam President, I do understand that in the global landscape, there are certain prices that most countries would abide by, especially if you are importing a good. But this is an item that we will grow in St. Lucia. And I think it is up to us to determine what price we set that item at. Further, and just to strengthen or to provide elucidation to Senator Charles's question about whether there would be consultation, none of this is new, Madam President. With every establishment of a board, with every instruction coming from a minister, it is not as if the minister wakes up first thing in the morning and decides that I'm going to provide some sort of regulation to cannabis. It is always coming from a place of consultation. In addition to that, Madam President, the independent senator spoke of what he termed to be a draconian fine, a draconian penalty. And I had to go back to the bill, and I want to bring members' attention to page 45, which speaks of confidentiality and oath of secrecy or affirmation. And Madam President, if you just beg me a minute, I would just read it so we can understand what I'm trying to say. And part 3 says, a member of the board, secretary, employee, agent, or advisor of the authority, or a member of the tribunal and the recording secretary shall not disclose any information relating to business affairs, applications, And it goes on to Part D, which says the affairs of an applicant, medical practitioner, patient, caregivers, or other such persons that the member, employee, agent, or advisor has acquired in the course of his or her duties or in the exercise of the authorities function under this act or any other law. And it goes down to Part 5, which says that a person who contravenes subsection 3 commits an offense and A, shall compensate for any loss, suffered or benefits received from the use of the information, and B, is liable on summary conviction to a fine not exceeding $25,000 or to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 6 months. So what was mentioned of the $100,000 does not apply fully to the entire bill. And we have to understand that certain fines, and I am no judge, jury, executioner to determine what the fines are supposed to be, but the Attorney General, under the advice of his office and other legislators, would know what the conviction or what the fine should be for breach of confidentiality. Madam President, this is persons' private information we are talking about, their medical information. And just as there would be fines for breach of oath or breach of secrecy by a medical professional, it is simply stated here that this fine can apply if there is a certain breach of confidentiality. So in effect, it is not entirely quote-unquote draconian, as the independent senator would have said, because there are different fines that apply to different sections. Madam President, I wanted to make those brief interventions because I thought it was very important for us to understand these things. And what I want members, opposites, and just anybody listening to understand is that most times when we make those recommendations and we make these laws, it is not because we believe that we have the cookie cutter idea of how it's supposed to be. There are always things that the government would be willing to accept and look over, but I think we have made tremendous strides with this bill, Madam President. I think this is a third intervention by the government to ensure that we get one step closer in terms of regulating what is going on. I appreciate the appointment of the various boards because I understand that the persons who are on the board of the Regulated Substances Act and the persons who are on the board of the fund are not entirely the same, and these serve two different purposes. But yes, Madam President, as I have said and as I close, I want to extend my full support for this bill. I think it's remarkable that we have come in less than 2.5 years to show St. Lucians that we continue to make strides in something that is so very important. Oh, and one more thing, Madam President. The member opposite did speak of the addition of the Rastafarian community, and another member on his team spoke of it may be a potential conflict of interest. But I just wanted to remind the senators that this bill is not just specific to cannabis, that this bill speaks in wholesome of regulated substances. So, Madam President, with this, I just want to say I fully support this bill.